Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
A conversation with Lincoln Caplan. He is a senior research scholar and the Truman Capote visiting lecturer at the Yale Law School. He is a contributing editor at Harvard Magazine, a contributor to The New Yorker, and he wrote about the Supreme Court as a member of the editorial board at the New York Times. His most recent book is American Justice 2016, The Political Supreme Court. Lincoln Caplan, it's a great privilege to have you on this program, sir. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thanks very much.
What crosses Lincoln Caplan's mind on the eve of this unbelievably historic, and not always for the right reasons, but this historic election that we have seen has so many unprecedented elements to it, at least in the modern age? What's crossing your mind today, Lincoln?
The Senate. All the way along through this election, there's been tremendous attention paid to the two candidates and the very different conceptions of the Supreme Court that their different administrations would have. But at this point, the drama about the Senate, which looks to be a toss-up, is just as important. Because you've got a bunch of Republicans saying that if Hillary Clinton is elected president, they will do their best to stonewall for 4 years and keep anyone from being confirmed to the Supreme Court. There's a tremendous pushback on that position coming from more moderate Republicans, so that story is not determined yet. But it would be much better for the country, from my point of view, if you're looking at the interests of the Supreme Court, to have not only Hillary Clinton be elected president, but also to have a Democratic Senate so that her nominees to the court could be confirmed. Of course, right now the nomination of Merrick Garland made by President Obama is pending, and that moderate flank of the Republican senators is saying that they expect that Garland's nomination would be considered by the Senate and that he would be confirmed. And my sense is that would be not only good for the country, but it would be good for the court. This is a court that is divided now in a way that it's never been throughout American history. You've got 4 liberals who were appointed by Democrats and 4 conservatives who were appointed by Republicans, and that stalemate, in some sense, has diminished the court. Merrick Garland, because he's a minimalist by conviction, a true moderate liberal, has the potential to help the court be whole in the sense of each side listening to the other in a way that it hasn't always done over the last generation. He's a superb judge, widely respected by people across the ideological spectrum on his own court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. And it would be great to have this long disrespect for his nomination ended and to have him considered and confirmed.
And forgive my ignorance, has Hillary Clinton said that she would nominate him, or what happens to his nomination when a new administration comes in?
So right now his nomination is for the current Congress, and the best hope for his being confirmed is to have that done in a lame duck session after the election, but before President-elect Clinton would be sworn in as president. She has said in each of the debates that she would favor the Senate considering him in the lame duck session and confirming him. She hasn't said whether she would renominate him, but it's heavily in her interest to have this nomination considered and confirmed before she's sworn in, so that that drama is out of the way and she can get her own executive appointees considered and confirmed, so she has a team in place to do the country's business.
You write about the political Supreme Court. What is it that you really want people to understand about the Supreme Court, that based on your years of covering the court and researching and writing about the court, what is it that most Americans don't get?
The Supreme Court is a political institution in some ways that should be very uncontroversial. The president makes nominations. He's elected, and one of the things we elect a president for is to make those nominations when there's a vacancy on the court. The Senate has an advice and consent function in the Constitution, which, by the way, it has not fulfilled in a way that's arguably unconstitutional over the last 200-plus days, but it's elected to do that. And the court has a role in resolving the most difficult constitutional questions that inevitably involved policy and politics. So in that sense, the court is uncontroversially political, but it's not often talked about that way. The way it's controversial is that in the last 5 years or so, since Justice Kagan replaced Justice John Paul Stevens on the court, the divisions have been not only ideological, but they've been partisan in the sense that the justices have reflected the interests of the party of the president that appointed them. And one of the key points that I'd like readers to take away from this book is that we're in our 48th year of a Republican court. That is, since Richard Nixon appointed the conservative Warren Burger to be Chief Justice in 1969, the court has increasingly moved to the right. Political scientists have a very disciplined way of measuring the outcome of cases, and the evidence is quite convincing to me that, while there have, of course, been important exceptions, like the same-sex marriage ruling of not long ago, by and large, in criminal law, in civil rights law, in all kinds of other areas, the court has moved to the right, and I want to emphasize that because it also makes clear how important it is for people to recognize that they are likely to be shaping the Supreme Court at the same time that they're choosing someone to be president of the United States, and at the same time that they're voting for their senator. A second point that I want to emphasize is that this is especially intense now because the way Americans think about themselves, their identities, have really shifted over the last couple of decades. It used to be when surveys were done about people's political views, they were asked to identify themselves, and they identified themselves by their place and by their gender and by their religion and by their work and various other ways, and they would come to identifying themselves as Republicans or Democrats or something else politically, sixth or seventh on the list. Now that's often the first thing and the most important thing that someone thinks defines them. So the division in the law that we used to talk about ideologically and now seems to be a kind of partisan divide on the Supreme Court is especially important to the country because people think of themselves as Republicans and Democrats. They think of themselves as divided that way. So the division on the court reflects something deep and important about the country. And one of the conclusions that I reached in doing this reporting and thinking is that it would be good for the country if justices now served 18-year terms in good health and good behavior rather than life terms. That would mean that every president would have a a nomination to make every other year. A president who served 2 terms would have the opportunity to nominate 4 justices for the court. It would take some of the drama and the heat out of the very controversial, often carnival-like confirmation process, because the country would get used to those happening on a regular basis, usually every 2 years, and it would make clear that, well, the court is obviously a legal institution. It makes decisions based on law and often focusing on improvements in the workings of the law. It is at the same time a political institution, and the court would be healthier if we had that expectation about it.
We're talking with legal scholar and author Lincoln Caplan. His new book is American Justice 2016, The Political Supreme Court. Lincoln, you mentioned the tactics of political obstructionism in the Senate, and we've even heard some Republicans saying that they're going to immediately call for Hillary Clinton's impeachment if she wins. I wanted you to connect some dots for me. When we see those tactics of obstructionism combined with the constant delegitimization of our institutions, at what point do these institutions fail? When we hear Donald Trump over and over again with this public narrative of the system is rigged against you, the system is rigged against me, the elections no longer work, and when we have people in the same party who intentionally cripple an institution by not upholding the constitutional responsibilities they have, we stand the very real danger of seeing these institutions fail before our eyes. I've just
come from teaching a writing seminar, and my students were talking about this today. And one of the things that they were talking about is that the difference between, say, the Senate 20 years ago and the Senate today, in reading about, for example, the bipartisan effort that Senator Edward Kennedy and Senator Orrin Hatch were often at the center of, you had a sense that they thought of themselves as lawmakers, that their job was to try to address significant problems through sensible lawmaking. And now you have a sense that a significant membership of the Senate, a significant part of the Senate, don't think of themselves as lawmakers. They think of themselves as partisans and articulators of partisan interests, and that's the justification for saying ahead of time that they are thinking about keeping the court at 8 members, or if another justice retires or dies, in a sense, keeping the court from getting to the full number of 9 that we now expect and that it needs in order to be able to break ties and do its business. And similarly, as you mentioned, the threats of impeaching President Clinton, even though there's no basis for impeachment, and she will have just been elected. And I think that this very bruising election has been costly to all kinds of aspects in American society, but the law is very, very high on the list. I mean, you have just today the news about Director Comey of the FBI saying that his team, having reviewed the evidence, that they didn't find any evidence that would change their conclusion in July that they shouldn't recommend prosecution of Secretary Clinton for misuse of emails and transmitting or communicating classified information. But the FBI has long prided itself as being separate from politics, of being punctilious about its investigations and its recommendations, and you have absolutely the politicization of the highest office of the FBI just in the last 2 weeks. You can be sympathetic to Director Comey that he felt he had an obligation to report to Congress if he learned anything that changed the judgment that he articulated in July, but the timing of it and the departure from Justice Department protocol and policy, which is to within 60 days of an election to avoid any indictments or any public statements about ongoing investigations that could affect the election. I mean, that's the rankest form of politicization, and there's so much other evidence of that in this campaign. Mr. Trump's saying to Hillary Clinton that she should be in jail, and his Justice Department would put her in jail. His disrespect for the federal district judge who is handling the civil case involving Trump University, on and on. And one of the reasons why this is of special concern to me now is that in some ways this traces back to the Supreme Court. Bush v. Gore is cited today in the very good editorial of the New York Times about the potential coup against the Supreme Court, which begins with the refusal of the Senate to consider the Garlick nomination, and now is in the threat that Republicans will try to keep that seat being filled for the next 4 years. But what that editorial leaves out is that that was the short-term benefit in Bush v. Gore was that Al Gore gave a very important speech saying that he accepted the outcome of the court, even though he disagreed with it. But the long-term cost of Bush v. Gore was that it was clearly a political decision by the court handing the presidency to George W. Bush, and its political nature was emphasized by the fact that the court said explicitly that decision had no precedential value, that it had a one-time effect in that particular case, and that outcome, of course, led to the Roberts Court in the sense that John Roberts was appointed and confirmed to replace William Rehnquist as Chief Justice, and Samuel Alito was picked and confirmed to replace Sandra Day O'Connor, and immediately moved the court to the right. And it's the Roberts Court which now has this historically unprecedented divide of partisanship, in the sense that the ideological divide between left and right on the court happens to line up with the parties of the appointing, the nominating presidents. And so, in some sense, that political moment in Bush v. Gore, that politicization of the court, by the institution that's the pinnacle of the American constitutional system, was giving permission in a way for a kind of contempt for the law, certainly a disrespect for the law that traces all the way down through the very core statements of Mr. Trump. And rebuilding that respect is so difficult because these institutions inherently have some political aspect, which puts an even greater burden on people who are exercising power in the legal institutions to win our respect by making sure that their legal decisions really make sense in terms of legal logic and end up earning a kind of wide support from people, even if they might have some disagreement with how the court got there. And as I said, Bush v. Gore is a kind of dramatic moment when the law got politicized, and there are so many moments between then and now which make the very difficult moment that we've arrived at not so surprising.
We're talking with Lincoln Caplan. The new book is American Justice 2016. Jim Ruttenberg has an article in today's Times looking at journalism and facts and media, and I wanted to get your thoughts. You work as a legal scholar, but you also work in the landscape of print publications and journalism, and we're seeing a very fascinating dynamic in the presidential election this year, which seems to echo from really the very beginnings of the modern conservative movement in the 50s. And it strikes me as very medieval. It's this embrace, very strong, almost religious-like commitment and embrace of a narrative, of a belief, of a story, and demanding that the facts fit that narrative, and not the other way around, that our facts and our truths would inform our beliefs, which would inform our public policies. And that was one of the foundational beliefs of the modern world. And it's right there in the Constitution. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's there in the 18th century. The French philosophes and the Scottish moralists. And it was a revolutionary idea that facts come first. Facts inform beliefs, and not the other way around. And we seem to have millions of Americans today who are ready and willing to embrace what I believe is a medieval way of thinking, that my belief comes first, and I'm sure the facts will be there at some point. It's a religious way of thinking, and when we see it in our political debates, when we see it in our politics, Hillary Clinton is a killer, she's a murderer, and there may not be the facts, but I'm sure they're there if they look hard enough. And we see this way of thinking on the part of elected officials who are in office in Washington. Take a moment to share your thoughts about this dynamic that we're seeing at play this year.
My concern is the structural change in journalism that allows that to be as virulent as it is. When those extreme views were articulated in the 50s and the 60s, journalism was solid enough in structure and economically, so that what journalism is best at, which is reporting facts, explaining facts, and interpreting facts, was the dominant contribution of journalism, and it was dominant as the form of journalism that people received by radio or in their local newspaper, and increasingly through national television in those decades. Now, because journalism is reeling, the business models are basically broken, and new technologies allow people to choose the form of information that they want to hear. It means that the best of journalism doesn't get out, and there's less of it because there's less money to support what journalism needs most to do, which is to go out and report and learn things, and then report back to a readership, a listenership, a viewership, and also because people can select what reinforces their biases. The extremism in the political culture and in the society at large gets reinforced by what people think of as information, even though much of it is bias, and the result is a kind of frenzy and divide that is greater than any other time I can think of in the last 150 years. So it's just a huge problem, and there's no solution in sight.
When you say it's a huge problem, let me just take a quick moment to underscore that, because the free press, what we might today call, the Fourth Estate in journalism, what Jefferson called a free press and public education were among the essential tools that founders, men like Jefferson and Madison, gave us specifically so that we could avoid a Trump, so that we could avoid having a demagogue rise to power in America. And the belief was that these citizens will be informed. They will be informed, and they will be able to make informed decisions when they choose their leaders. But we've seen an assault on the very tools and the institutions that were created to preserve our liberty, to preserve the ability we have to find and share truths with each other, and then to speak those truths to power.
And the Supreme Court was at its best in underscoring that, and much more recently it's been at its worst. Its best was New York Times v. Sullivan, emphasizing the role that the press plays in a well-informed and properly functioning democracy, and by contrast, in Citizens United, when the conservative majority of the court by 5-4 reinforced its equation of speech and money, and therefore began to unravel campaign finance regulation, it unleashed money in politics to overwhelm information in some sense, and that's another big part of the problem.
Are we frantically shaking our hands and our hair is on fire and we're so worried about things with perhaps some undue cause, without perhaps some historic context? We've gone to war with each other before. It's at least it's not that bad. I mean, have things been worse? And is this just how it's always been? Or is there something truly unique about today?
You know, the crisis in the court in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt and then a Democratic Congress were overwhelmingly elected to use government to try to solve the grievous problems of the Great Depression, and the Supreme Court consistently for several years struck down legislation that was designed to help solve those problems. I mean, that was a real deep crisis, and it was a crisis that involved very different perceptions of the court's role and of how to interpret the Constitution, and it got resolved, and while there have been clearly moments of profound disagreement on the court since then, I'd say that the political divide on the court now takes us back to that moment, and it just really emphasizes that well, there's an ideal of thinking about the law as above politics. The court doesn't function that way, and so the court has to find a way, and we have to find a way of thinking about the court as both a political and a legal institution, so that it succeeds on both counts. And I have some thoughts about how that might come about, but simply understanding that that's the reality, and not thinking about the court as above politics would be a great step forward.
And I think embracing your proposal, and you're not the first to make it, I'm sure, but your proposal that we end this medieval tradition of being appointed for life, that's a monarchy. You know, I mean, that's the fact that we would have that clearly demonstrates that these rules were written in the 18th century, and here we are in the 21st, still with this ancient practice. It just makes no sense.
The rules were written with very, very good premises in mind. The idea was that you didn't want judges beholden to a president in the way that the judges in the colonial days had been beholden to the crown, and so you wanted them to be independent in two ways: that their pay couldn't be cut if someone disagreed with a decision they reached, and that they would serve for life, so that they would be insulated from politics. But the expectation was that people were going to serve much shorter terms, and what's happened with the extension of life over the last generations is that justices have sometimes served for 2, 3, well, even into 4 decades, and so that they've served for a long time, and they've perpetuated a kind of political bias, as I was describing earlier, with an almost half-century-long Republican court, and for a bunch of reasons, with circumstances changed, it makes sense to change the rules as well. And there are a number of other things that could be done that would address the question of the court's legitimacy in the public's mind, and I think would be better for the court as well as for the country. But right now, from my point of view, it would be best for court and country to have Hillary Clinton elected president and to have a Democratic Senate so that nominees to the court would be confirmed, and that would be a good start.
Lincoln Caplan is a senior research scholar and the Truman Capote visiting lecturer in law at the Yale Law School. His most recent book is American Justice 2016, The Political Supreme Court. Lincoln, it's been a real privilege to have you on this program, sir. I cannot thank you enough for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
You know, I am a journalist by trade, but I'm an anthropologist by training, and I am very proud to be a graduate of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Virginia. And I can think of no better way to help us make sense of the historic and to millions of Americans startling results of the recent presidential election than by talking with a professor of anthropology. My good friend Richard Handler joins me on the program. Richard is an anthropologist and director of the Global Studies program at the University of Virginia. Thank you, sir, for being here.
My pleasure. We've had many talks in many coffee shops.
Yes, we have indeed. I'm so glad you could be here. So, Richard, help us. Based on your training and your many, many years studying culture around the world and nationalist, populist movements, how do you make sense? And what's the frame that you look through to understand what is taking place now in America?
Well, of course, it's a fascinating moment. Certainly I, as an intellectual, as a voter, find it a frightening moment, but it's a fascinating moment because Trump versus Clinton brought out so many kind of deep structural tensions in in American culture that anyone who has studied our continent, our nation state, can see being repeated over and over again. So I tend to think of this there's a lot of talk now about, we've made so much progress, now we're going back. And the problem with that narrative is that I don't know that we can ever escape this back and forth between what Trump has catalyzed and what the Democrats or what Barack Obama catalyzed. I see this going all the way back to the origins of the problem of slavery at the beginning of the nation, which creates a nation that has a kind of deep contradiction at the center of it, which on the one hand, all men, I suppose, or all people are created equal, on the other hand, slavery. And we keep going back and forth between those two positions.
That tension is in our DNA as Americans.
It's in the DNA, and you can see it over and over again. And I would like to frame this actually in terms of a couple of questions that you and I have talked about. One way to talk about that tension is to talk about the question of who is a real American. And so the white side, the black side, you can think of it that way. Or another way to think about it is who gets to count as a person, who gets to be an American. So if you have a founding document that says all men are created equal and men comes to mean people, you still have the problem is who is a person. So if you have a group of people who are enslaved, they're not persons under that model, or not complete persons. Is a fetus a person? Is a child a person? Well, yes, a child is a person, but a child doesn't get to vote. Is a woman a person? It took women a long time.
Is a corporation a person?
Is a corporation a person? So you have these and those two questions, who is a person and what is the real America, intersect, because as a nation state, the term "the real America" or "make America great again," make it real again, would identify the people who are the real Americans and would get rid of the people who aren't the real Americans, such as the people who are not supposed to be undocumented people,
right.
or Black Lives Matter people, depending on how you define the other.
Yeah.
So,
and Trump has spent years defining the other as Barack Obama. That
well,
he's
in
not
racial terms.
Genuine. Yeah, he's from Africa.
Right.
Show me your birth certificate.
Right.
He was the president of the birthers before he became president-elect of America.
Right, and of course Trump's history as a racist, or his racist actions, I don't know that we need to call people racists, but we can certainly identify actions that are racist,
Yeah.
and it goes all the way back to the 60s with the lawsuit against the housing discrimination.
Yeah, very well documented.
Yeah, so you have Trump bringing to the surface in a very, very media-savvy way a kind of racism and a misogyny. And so women are not persons the way men are, and people of color are not persons the way we white people are. And he...
and the political establishment, politicians, journalists, professors, they're not real Americans.
They're not real Americans
like you are.
That's right.
The rural, white, often less educated supporters that he had at those rallies in terrific numbers. That was his message to them.
Right.
None of these people aren't real people like you are, and these people aren't real Americans like you are.
And that's another dichotomy, elites versus real people.
Yeah.
And, all elites are not liberals or left-wing people, but they've been portrayed that way.
Yeah.
And another dichotomy is city-country. So it's just amazing that if you think of the election, Hillary Clinton won more votes than Donald Trump. Probably most of her votes came from cities. And so if you look at the map of America, it looks almost completely red, but those are very sparsely populated areas. But there's a long tradition of city versus country, with the idea that the city is the place of vice, it's the place of foreigners, it's the place, and Trump, there's great irony, Trump is a New Yorker, and the country is
corruption,
the place, and that's the country with the white, the sylvan spaces. So Trump just, kind of masterfully exploited that. And another theme that I want to bring to the table that I mentioned to you a few days ago, if you think that the elites are not real people, the real people are out there in the countryside, and politicians, of course, are said to be they're not authentic, they're not real people. And I think one thing that you have the Trump versus Bernie phenomenon, and I think Trump is absolutely brilliant. I was not sure it's brilliant, it may just be a kind of canniness, but I think of Trump as a completely authentic liar. He's P.T. Barnum. He's a completely authentic con man, because here's this guy who just lies constantly, and everybody knows he's lying, and says outrageous things like Hillary Clinton should be jailed or something like that. And people in the crowd, on the one hand, they may like the idea that Hillary Clinton should be jailed, but in some way they know that some of this is not to be said or is wrong, but they love the fact that he's willing to say it. Even the not showing your taxes, Trump.
His supporters admired that.
Yeah, because he's authentically an authentic manipulator, an authentic con man.
And they liked the fact that he was standing up to the establishment.
Exactly.
The establishment, the journalists, they got their hands out for your tax returns. Don't give it to them.
Right. And
screw those people.
And Clinton, of course, who I think has many virtues, but nonetheless, she represented the establishment. We should remember that it's been very hard historically since Roosevelt for parties to hold the White House for more than 2 terms.
Right.
I think Reagan and the first Bush is the only example of 3 terms. And Reagan and the second Bush lost to Clinton.
Yeah.
So it's hard. People said that in a normal year, the Democrats would have a hard time holding the White House.
Yeah.
That they also said if there had been a decent candidate, Bush, Rubio, Clinton wouldn't have had a chance.
And Americans have always been we're talking here about these long narratives that have been at work at play
Right.
here. In a sense, there's very little that's new here.
Right, that's exactly right.
Because, Thomas Jefferson was the anti-establishment candidate in 1800.
And a slaveholder. Both.
And a slaveholder.
Yeah, and he was country versus city.
Right,
and
he
so
was
on.
running on this idea that I'm a simple farmer
Right.
and I'm from the rural countryside where real Americans live and not you corrupt people in Washington.
Right, so Trump, I think it was just remarkable that he was able to parlay the absolute willingness to lie or to say anything or to be shocking into people bought that as this is a genuine person.
Yeah.
And of course Bernie was a genuine actor also, but for very different reasons. Bernie's a real person because he's the rare politician who seems to have a kind of a consistent message, and he doesn't hedge very much. Clinton's been around in the spotlight so much longer that she's been attacked so vociferously that she has to be very careful in what she says. And I don't think Bernie had to be particularly careful. And in those moments in the campaign when he was sort of caught, when the Black Lives Matter folks confronted him.
Said, you don't really care about us.
He gave them the microphone, and he was able to get through that. That didn't damage much his image as a person who's really authentic. And
well, throughout this, I've done so many interviews over the last few months, Richard, of scholars saying, Donald Trump is a classic demagogue.
Right.
He is exactly what the founders warned us about,
right.
because they were terrific students of history. They knew Greek and Roman history. They grew up on stories of Caesar, and they knew how demagogues played on fear, played on prejudices, played on anger, especially among a mob, a citizenry. And they knew that person who does that as a political tactic to empower himself, history tells us over and over again, is a very dangerous person.
Yeah, and I don't know if they would have come up with the idea of sort of the authentic liar. I don't know if they would have thought of demagogues that way. Perhaps they would have. So you're absolutely right. And of course, Trump, I feel that the Obama presidency was a kind of an accident. So in the sense that I never thought I would see an African American in the White House in my lifetime.
I didn't either. Yeah.
And the Bush presidency was a disaster due to an unforeseen event, which is to say 9/11, which led him into a disastrous war, which destroyed the Republican credibility. And Obama came along, got into the limelight in the 2004 election as a wonderful speaker and a charismatic leader.
Right.
And was able to win the nomination in 2008. So you get the first African-American president in history. And I don't know if this is your recollection of it, but my recollection is that sort of for 1 or 2 days, people almost across the spectrum said, this is wonderful, this shows what a great place America is. There's a very brief moment of that, and then of course the racism surfaced. The people, the crying white people saying, this, I want my country back.
It wasn't until January of 2009 that we started seeing what would become the Tea Party start to come together through the protests against his presidency. Richard, early in this conversation we talked about the original sin of slavery and that tension that has always been part of the American story. It's not new, it's always there, this culture of contradiction and this interplay. What does it say about America in the context of that tension that the first president that the nation chooses following its first African-American president is Donald Trump, who has demonstrated for decades, very well documented, racist behavior, misogyny. For years he was accusing the president of not being a quote-unquote real American, of being African. And it's all racist code language. You're not one of us.
Right.
You're from Africa.
Well, my own sense of this is that and I don't know what a historian would say, but I would say that the original sin is so profound that it will take centuries to work its way out. It's so difficult to talk about. If you think of an issue like reparations, which make almost no sense to white people, but if you thought about it, if you came from Mars and you looked at the situation and you said that people who'd been enslaved for 200 years and had their labor stolen for 100 or 200 years, maybe they do deserve something like reparations. So, but my point is that the original sin is so profound, you can't simply transcend it. And one of the things that's happened in the last 50 years is that with the civil rights movement in the 50s, and then the various feminist movements, both African American people and women gained a new level of esteem, or earned the right to certain kind of respect, earned the right to be seen as persons in America.
Yeah.
But this finally, but this deeply troubles some people who, sort of the other side.
Right.
And I believe that one of the early manifestations of this is part of the story that the Trump story is the fight over political correctness, or the notion of the PC. So in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when feminists and African Americans and various others began to demand respect, you can't say these words anymore, you can't treat us this way, that then got labeled by the other side as being a kind of policing of their right to express themselves. And they started using the term political correctness, which is a kind of neutral way. What I think political correctness is, it's anti-racism. So if you think of the civil rights movement, that's anti-racism. They make some gains, and then...
But then there's pushback.
There's pushback.
There's backlash.
And you can't... The pushback doesn't say we're in favor of racism. It says you folks have instituted this thought police stuff on us, which we're going to call PC, and we're against that. And so here you have Trump, who's a master. He says, I don't care about PC. I'm going to, call women, or I'm going to use these words. I'm going to say
I'm going to say
things.
what I want to say, and his supporters love that.
Right.
He speaks his mind.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems that the Democrats had was, and I'm not sure of this, but if you think about the speeches or the rallies that Clinton and her surrogates gave, they would denounce Trump. They would say, you've insulted women, you've insulted black people, you've insulted Mexicans. So their argument was an anti-racist argument in very simple terms. But they had no way to talk. What they needed was an anti-racist argument, and they had no way to conceptualize it. I mean, they needed to be able to say, there's a reason that Trump gets so much power from saying these things out loud, because the other side feels so burdened by not being allowed to say these things. They feel muzzled. They feel muzzled. Right?
I feel muzzled because I can't be a racist.
It's an attack
I can't be a misogynist.
Right. It's an attack on free speech.
Right. Free speech to me means saying the N-word when I want to.
That's right.
Or calling a coworker who happens to be a female some kind of epithet in the workplace. I should be able to do that.
Exactly. And I think this anger has built up for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
Then you get the Obama presidency, and as I like to say to my students, a black man in the White House, the symbol, it drove these people nuts. And not to mention the fact, we could say that Republicans, just policy-wise, they've always hated these safety net programs. For reasons I don't completely understand, but they're deeply against a federal health plan.
Yeah.
And so that added to it.
They've been opposed to this kind of stuff back to FDR.
That's right. So there are political
Unless
motives.
it's a social safety net for Wall Street, and that's going to bail out companies that have been run into the ground by their corporate boards.
But they're even willing to not be in favor of that, and Obama gets criticized by the real Americans for bailing out Wall Street.
Yeah,
so that becomes a complicated
What do you think
conversation.
about, you've spent a lot of time studying nationalist movements. What should we understand about the nationalism that we've seen over the last few months? And what do you think it means going forward? How should we really, because there's something very deep and important there that Trump has tapped into.
It's actually, I don't think that hard to understand, and we've already, or the basic model, and we've already talked about it. So in nationalisms, whether it's American or Canadian or French, the nation is defined as a bounded group, so we know who we are, and those people over there are not us. They're clear boundaries, and then you have to define who is it who's in the in-group. And as I said, a struggle from the beginning in the American story is who gets to count as a person. So nation states are...
the very idea of citizenship,
citizenship
is a club.
Right.
We can decide who gets it and who doesn't.
And look at how important boundaries are. So yes, you can have immigrants who come across the boundary, across the border, but they can't pierce it or violate it in an illegal way because, and this is common to nationalisms, if you let in alien elements in an uncontrolled fashion, They will pollute and destroy the nation, which has to be pure, real, however you define
And
it.
this isn't America in the 21st century. This is the human story.
Well, it's the nationalist story.
Yeah,
This model only, this model is maybe 3 centuries old. So if you think of the medieval European world, it's not built that way. Knights and serfs are not the same kind of people, and they're not supposed to be the same kind of people. So those are not societies that are built on the idea that everybody's the same. You can have a society that's built on the idea that everybody is different and contributes in different ways.
Right,
But modernity, these nation states are defined as everybody is the same. But then the problem is, what's the definition of same? And that's what we're seeing this fight is about. Man, woman, black, white, documented, undocumented.
All these structural tensions that have been at play since the very beginning.
But it's a very simple question. We have boundaries. We are united. Who are we?
Yeah.
It's really simple.
So we don't want to leave viewers with the impression that, oh, well, this is an old story, it's all been around, because you actually began the conversation by saying the results of this election I find frightening. What is it that's particularly unique? And I know you're not a political scientist, but what's unique in this iteration of that historic tension?
I think what's good about the current moment is that Trump has actually brought to the surface these simmering tensions and has forced people to confront them. I think that's valuable. What's bad about it is that Trump has surrounded himself with really violent, vile people, and of course I'm a Jewish person, and there are openly anti-Semitic people in Trump's world.
Absolutely.
And we just don't know. There's the whole business about he doesn't know what he's doing. He's not a politician. He doesn't know about anything about running something like the federal government. So it's going to be turned over to professional Republican politicians, leavened by or accompanied by these people who are allowed to be openly racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynist. And we just don't know where that's going to take us. I doubt in my lifetime that I'll see them rounding me up because of my background. But of course, with the example of Nazi Germany, everybody has to think about that.
Yeah, because you just don't know.
You just don't know where it's going to go.
And when Hitler rose to power early on, no one in Germany foresaw what it would happen. And we should remind people that at the time, Germany was the most literate, educated, cultured country on the planet.
Yeah, but this is not about education. It's about sort of deeply irrational cultural dichotomies.
Let me pick up on that point, because you say this is not about education. What's your reaction to the vilification that we see from the Trump campaign and his supporters against people like you and me, journalists, professors? Are we just part of that establishment that they find so horrifying and anti-American?
I suppose. I think this is a hard question, and I'm not sure I can give you a good answer. But clearly, part of it is the reaction against elites. They don't want elites telling them what to believe or what to think. And part of it is that they perceive many of these elites to be left-wing, and actually Jewish, for that matter. Even though, of course, universities, if you look at universities across their entirety, they are not uniformly left-wing. Anthropology departments are, but business schools are not, or engineering schools are not, religious schools are not. So it's actually a kind of a myth that the professoriate is uniformly left. But that certainly is a myth that Trump and his allies were able to, and many other people have promoted.
Speaking of the university, I'm curious, over the last few days, in your classes, what's been the reaction of your students when they come to class? Are they talking about this?
So I taught a class on Wednesday, a class of 120 students, and I taught a class on Thursday, a class of 150 students. And I should tell the audience that my classes are not a random sample, because I'm known as a professor with a certain orientation, and so my audience is heavily liberal, and it's also heavily female. Anthropology students as undergraduates are heavily female. That's true across the country. Remember that UVA is now 55-45 women to men. So any class is going to have...
Isn't that amazing?
But my classes are probably 75-25 women to men. And that's because of the things I teach and my orientation. But anyway, the students many of them were very, very distressed. I had 2 or 3 white women, in fact, break down in tears. Both white women and women of color talked about being afraid of violence against them on the part of white men or just on the part of the outside world. One thoughtful white man spoke up and identified himself as a kind of moderate Republican and was kind of bewildered as to why any of the women in the class would be afraid of him. And in one case, we had a couple of Trump supporters talk about how the fact that at a place like UVA, if they said they were Trump supporters, they would be vilified. And I think in our class period, we did very well with that. Everybody listened to everybody else. But in general, the audience that I draw of the liberal women, both white and of color, frightened, distressed, probably frightened and distressed more than angry, some anger, some expressions of we must become more political, some expressions of from students who are deeply committed to environmental issues and know that Trump is the guy that says climate change is a hoax.
Invented by the Chinese.
Invented by the Chinese. So two or three students expressed grave worries about that. So that's the range of opinions I heard.
Are they overreacting, you think, Richard? We're seeing protests in the streets. We're seeing, people moving to Canada or talking about it.
Why should we talk about overreaction? This is social life, right? This is an election as an important event. It is designed to, as a ritual, to increase people's public awareness and get them to express their participation in the nation. And part of one's participation in the nation can be a cry of dismay at the direction the nation is taking. So I don't think we should call it an overreaction. We should call it a kind of full participation in a ritual.
We're doing exactly what we're supposed to do in this culture.
In a ritual that happens every 4 years. So I don't think we have to say that it's an overreaction. I will say to you and the audience that I tried to conduct these talks with my students in a very respectful way. I asked them, did they want me to lecture and hold class, or did they want to process the election? And of let's say 250 students, only one said she didn't want to talk about it.
Wow.
And I made sure, but she said, if you all want to talk about it, go ahead. And I made sure she was okay with that. But the point is, I was very careful to try to do this in a way that was constructive. So they're frightened and worked up, and who knows if they'll become, one of the things Bernie Sanders wanted was that young people get involved in politics.
There you go.
Yeah.
Richard, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it.
My
Thanks
pleasure.
so much. Richard Handler is a professor of anthropology at the University of Virginia and director of the Global Studies Program.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.